To my husband, Ethan.
The crystal flute in Ethan Caldwell's hand felt fragile, as if the slightest increase in pressure would shatter it into 1,000 diamond dust shards. It was a fitting metaphor for his marriage, he thought, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. A mask of polite disinterest he had perfected over 7 years of marriage to a sterling. It was New Year's Eve, 2018. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a blizzard was raging. The snow fell in heavy, silent sheets, burying the world in white. Inside, however, the air was stiflingly hot, thick with the scent of expensive pine, roasted duck, and the cloying perfume of old money. "Ethan, darling, move a little to the left. You're blocking the view of the fireplace," his mother-in-law, Constance, said, waving a manicured hand as if shooing away a fly. "Of course, Constance," Ethan murmured, stepping back into the shadows of the heavy velvet drapes. Ethan, 38, was a landscape architect. He worked with soil, stone, and the unpredictable rhythms of nature. His hands were often rough, his fingernails cut short. In a room full of hedge fund managers, media moguls, and corporate attorneys, he was the anomaly. He was the groundskeeper, as Vanessa's brother jokingly called him when he thought Ethan wasn't listening. Tonight, the teasing felt sharper. Vanessa stood by the grand piano, the focal point of the room. At 36, she was radiant, a creature of gold silk and sharp ambition. As the vice president of marketing for her father's media conglomerate, she commanded attention effortlessly. Her laughter rang out, a little too loud, a little too brittle. She had been drinking vintage Dom Perignon since noon. Standing uncomfortably close to her was Julian Thorne. Julian was everything Ethan was not. Loud, charismatic, and aggressively fashionable in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo. He was a venture capitalist who had recently partnered with Sterling Media. He leaned over the piano, whispering something to Vanessa that made her throw her head back and laugh, exposing the long, elegant line of her throat. Ethan looked away, focusing on his daughter, Lily, who was asleep on a sofa in the corner, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She was the only reason he was still here. The only reason he endured the condescension. "Attention, everyone!" Vanessa's father, Robert Sterling, boomed, tapping a spoon against his glass. The room fell silent. "A toast to the new year and to new partnerships!" He raised his glass toward Julian, who nodded smoothly. "And," Vanessa interrupted, her voice slightly slurred, stepping into the center of the room. She held her glass high, her eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Ethan. There was a glint in them, something cruel and reckless. "To my husband, Ethan." The room turned to look at him. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "For reminding us all," Vanessa continued, a smirk playing on her red lips, "that while some of us are busy building empires and changing the world, someone has to worry about where to plant the petunias." A ripple of laughter went through the room. It wasn't warm laughter. It was the sharp, jagged laughter of exclusion. "Oh, come on, Nessie," Julian chimed in, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Don't be mean. Dirt is very important. Without dirt, we wouldn't have anywhere to stand in our Guccis." The laughter grew louder. Robert Sterling chuckled, shaking his head as if it were all good fun. Ethan stood frozen. His hand gripped the glass so hard his knuckles turned white. It wasn't the insult to his profession that stung. He was used to that. It was the look in Vanessa's eyes. She was performing. She was humiliating him to entertain Julian. She was offering up his dignity as an appetizer for her lover. "To Ethan!" Vanessa shouted, finishing her champagne in one gulp. The most patient man in the world, or perhaps just the most oblivious. Ethan didn't drink. He placed his untouched glass on a side table. "I'm going to check on Lily," he said quietly, though no one was listening anymore. The DJ had started playing jazz, and the conversation had already shifted back to stocks and mergers. He walked out of the grand salon, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He needed air. He needed to escape the suffocating heat of the sterling wealth. He wandered down the hallway toward the winter garden, a glass-enclosed conservatory at the back of the house. It was his favorite room, filled with orchids and ferns, a place of silence. As he approached the double doors, he heard a sound, a giggle, a hushed whisper. The doors were slightly ajar. Through the gap, the moonlight reflected off the snow outside, illuminating the silhouettes inside. Vanessa was pressed against the glass wall of the conservatory. Julian was pressed against her. His hands were tangled in her hair, his mouth devouring hers. "God, Julian," Vanessa gasped, pulling back slightly. "He's right inside." "He won't do anything," Julian murmured, kissing her neck. "You said it yourself. He's safe, he's boring, he'll never leave the sterling money." "He really is pathetic, isn't he?" Vanessa whispered, her voice devoid of the affection she used to feign. "Staring at his plants while I run the company." "Forget him," Julian said. "Happy New Year, Vanessa." Ethan stood in the hallway, the darkness wrapping around him like a shroud. He watched his wife, the woman he had promised to love and cherish, the mother of his child, betray him not just with her body, but with her soul. She mocked his silence, mistaking his patience for weakness. A primal urge roared in his ears. He could kick the door open. He could drag Julian out into the snow. He could scream until the windows shattered. But then, he thought of Lily sleeping in the other room. He thought of the prenup that Robert Sterling's lawyers had drafted, ironclad and ruthless. If he made a scene tonight, if he acted out of anger, they would destroy him. They would take Lily. They would paint him as the unstable, jealous husband attacking the successful wife. Ethan took a deep breath. The air in the hallway was cold. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and silently snapped a photo through the crack in the door. The flash was off. The shutter was silent. He looked at the image on the screen. It was dark, grainy, but undeniable. Then he turned around. He walked back toward the party, his footsteps soundless on the thick Persian rugs. His face was a mask of stone. He didn't return to the salon. Instead, he went to the coat check, retrieved his heavy wool coat, and walked out the side door into the blizzard. The cold wind hit him like a physical blow, freezing the tears that threatened to fall. He stood there for a moment, watching the snow bury the driveway. "Happy New Year, Vanessa," he whispered to the empty night. He didn't know it yet, but the architecture of his revenge had just begun. And like the best buildings, it would be constructed slowly, with a foundation of absolute silence. The morning of January the 2nd arrived with a sky the color of bruised steel. The festive hysteria of New Year's Eve had evaporated, leaving behind the sterile, echoing silence of the Sterling estate. The maids were already moving like ghosts through the hallways, dismantling the garlands and sweeping away the pine needles, erasing the holidays with clinical efficiency. In the master bedroom, Ethan was awake. He hadn't slept. He stood by the walk-in closet, a single battered leather duffel bag open on the ottoman. It was a relic from his college days at Cornell, scuffed and worn, a stark contrast to the pristine Louis Vuitton luggage set stacked in the corner, a gift from Vanessa that he had never really liked. He wasn't packing clothes. He was packing his life. Or rather, the parts of his life that were actually his. He carefully placed his drafting rolls into a tube. Next went his favorite set of Staedtler pens, a sketchbook filled with charcoal drawings of the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, and a small, framed photograph of Lily taken at the zoo. He left the Rolex Vanessa had bought him for their 5th anniversary on the dresser. He left the silk ties, the Italian loafers, and the cashmere sweaters. They were costumes, and the play was over. "What are you doing?" The voice came from the doorway. Vanessa was leaning against the frame, wrapped in a silk robe, clutching a cup of black coffee. She looked pale, the remnants of a hangover softening the sharp angles of her face. There was no guilt in her eyes, only a mild, irritated confusion. Ethan didn't look up. He zipped the bag shut with a finality that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "I'm moving out," he said. His voice was steady, devoid of the tremor he had feared might be there. Vanessa laughed, a short, incredulous sound. She walked into the room, setting her coffee down on the marble vanity. "Don't be dramatic, Ethan. Is this about the toast? God, you have such thin skin. It was a joke." Everyone laughed. "I'm sure they did," Ethan said. He swung the bag over his shoulder. "Where are you going?" She crossed her arms, her irritation rising. "We have brunch with the board of directors at noon. You have to be there. My father expects—" "I'm not coming to brunch, Vanessa. I'm not coming to anything ever again." He turned to face her fully for the first time. He looked for the woman he had married 7 years ago, the ambitious but passionate girl who used to talk about art and dreams. She wasn't there. In her place was a corporate entity, a product of the Sterling machine, hollowed out by her need for validation and filled with the arrogance of inherited wealth. And, he knew now, filled with the secrets of another man. The image of her pressed against the glass with Julian flashed in his mind. The rage simmered deep in his gut, molten and hot, but he capped it. He refused to give her the satisfaction of a fight. If he screamed, she would call him crazy. If he cried, she would call him weak. "I spoke to a lawyer this morning," Ethan said. "He'll be sending the papers over by the end of the day. Irreconcilable differences. I'm not asking for alimony. I'm not asking for a share of the estate. I just want joint custody of Lily." Vanessa stared at him, her mouth slightly open. The mention of a lawyer and the fact that he wasn't asking for money threw her off script. She was used to people wanting things from her. She was used to buying silence and compliance. You're divorcing me?" Her shock quickly morphed into a defensive sneer. "Because of a joke? Or is this because you finally realized you don't belong here?" She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You're quitting. Just like you quit that firm in Chicago. You can't handle the pressure of being a Sterling, so you're running away to, what? Draw pictures of parks." "I'm not running, Vanessa," Ethan said softly. "I'm resigning." "You're pathetic," she spat, the venom finally surfacing. "Julian was right. You have no ambition. You're just a gardener in a suit. Go ahead, leave. But don't think for a second you're taking Lily out of her school or her life. She's a Sterling." "She's my daughter," Ethan said, his voice dropping an octave, hard as granite. "And if you try to use your father's lawyers to keep her from me, the conversation we have next won't be about irreconcilable differences. It will be about what happened in the winter garden 2 nights ago. The color drained from Vanessa's face. The sneer faltered. She froze, her eyes darting to his, searching for how much he knew. Ethan held her gaze. He didn't blink. He didn't need to say Julian's name. The silence between them grew heavy, suffocating, filled with the weight of her betrayal and his knowledge. "I'll pick Lily up on weekends," Ethan said, breaking the spell. He walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers. She didn't move. She stood paralyzed by the sudden realization that the boring man she had humiliated held a knife to her throat, and he had chosen, for now, not to cut. Ethan walked down the grand staircase, his footsteps echoing on the marble. He passed the dining room where the staff was setting the table for brunch. He didn't look back. Outside, his old Subaru Forester was parked in the driveway, looking out of place among the Range Rovers and Porsches. He threw his bag in the back seat and climbed in. As he drove out of the wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate, he didn't feel the crushing sadness he expected. He felt light. The air in the car tasted different, cleaner. He drove south, leaving the manicured perfection of Greenwich behind. He watched the landscape change from sprawling estates to the dense, gritty reality of New York City. He crossed the Triborough Bridge, the skyline of Manhattan rising like a fortress of steel and glass against the winter sky. He wasn't heading to Manhattan. He couldn't afford Manhattan. He ended up in Long Island City in a converted industrial warehouse near the East River. It was a neighborhood in transition, half factories, half rising condos. The apartment he had rented sight unseen that morning was a single room with exposed brick walls, a small kitchenette, and large, drafty windows that looked out over a train yard. It was freezing. The radiator hissed and clanked, struggling against the January chill. Ethan dropped his bag on the floor. The room was empty. No Persian rugs, no silk drapes, no grand piano. Just space. He walked to the window. In the distance, across the river, he could see the skyscrapers where the Sterlings played their games of power and influence. He could imagine Vanessa right now, spinning the narrative to her family. Poor Ethan. He just couldn't hack it. He was jealous of my success. Let them talk, he thought. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened the photo gallery. The picture of Vanessa and Julian was still there, a digital bomb waiting for the right moment to detonate. He didn't delete it, but he didn't post it either. He backed it up to an encrypted cloud server, then locked his phone. He knelt on the floor and unzipped his bag. He took out his drafting tube and unrolled a large sheet of paper on the bare wooden floor. It was a blueprint he had been working on in secret for months. A design for a public park built on the ruins of an old sugar refinery. A place where nature reclaimed the industrial wreckage. He took out a pen. The apartment was silent. But for the first time in years, it wasn't the silence of being silenced. It was the silence of a blank page. Ethan Caldwell uncapped the pen and made the first mark. He had a lot of work to do. 2 years is a long time in New York City. Long enough for skylines to shift, for restaurants to rise and fall, and for scandals to be buried under the relentless sediment of the news cycle. It was a Tuesday in late October 2020. The city was gray, draped in a persistent drizzle that slicked the cobblestones of Dumbo, Brooklyn. Inside a converted warehouse that smelled of roasted coffee and damp wool, Ethan Caldwell sat at a drafting table, his eyes gritty with exhaustion. The sign on the frosted glass door read simply, Caldwell Landscape Architecture. It was a small operation, just Ethan and 2 fresh graduates from Pratt, Maya, and David. The office was cluttered with topographical maps, soil samples in jars, and 3D printed models of urban parks. It was a far cry from the Sterling Estates' mahogany libraries, but to Ethan, it felt like a sanctuary. "Ethan, you need to see this," Maya said, her voice hesitant. She was holding an iPad, hovering near his desk. Ethan didn't look up from his blueprints. He was finalizing the drainage schematics for a pocket park in Queens. "If it's about the invoice for the granite suppliers, tell them I'll wire the funds on Friday." "It's not the suppliers," Maya said. She placed the iPad on his desk. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples, and looked at the screen. It was a live stream from page 6. The headline screamed in bold, serif font, "The Wedding of the Century, Vanessa Sterling and Julian Thorne. Tie the knot at the plaza." Ethan stared at the image. It was an assault of white roses and crystal chandeliers. Vanessa looked breathtaking, he had to admit. She wore a Vera Wang custom gown that likely cost more than Ethan's entire studio lease for the year. She was smiling, a practiced, camera-ready smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Beside her, Julian Thorne looked every bit the master of the universe, his arm possessing her waist, his teeth gleaming white. The article gushed about the guest list: senators, tech moguls, reality TV stars. It mentioned the 6-tier cake, the private performance by a Grammy-winning artist, and the fairy tale romance that had weathered the storm of Vanessa's unfortunate previous union. Unfortunate previous union. That was him. 3 words to summarize 7 years of his life. "Do you want me to turn it off?" Maya asked softly. She knew the history. Everyone did. The divorce had been quiet, but the gossip columns had been merciless, painting Ethan as the dull, unambitious anchor that had weighed Vanessa down. "No," Ethan said, his voice surprisingly calm. He swiped the screen, scrolling past the photos of the champagne tower and the caviar stations. He looked at Vanessa's face one last time. He didn't feel jealousy. He didn't feel anger. He felt relief. He saw the tension in Vanessa's jaw, the slight desperation in the way she gripped her bouquet. He knew that look. It was the look of someone maintaining a facade that was becoming too heavy to carry. She had married the man she wanted, the man who fit the brand. Now she would have to live with the performance 24/7. "It's fine, Maya," Ethan said, handing the iPad back. "It's just noise. Let's get back to work. The deadline for the Greenpoint proposal is at 5 p.m. Maya looked at him with a mix of confusion and admiration, then nodded and retreated to her desk. Ethan turned back to his drawing. The Greenpoint Esplanade was a massive project, a contest commissioned by the city to revitalize a decaying stretch of the waterfront. The biggest firms in the city were competing. Somm, Bjarke Ingels, the giants. Ethan was the underdog, the gardener, punching above his weight. He put his headphones on, drowning out the imaginary sound of wedding bells with the intricate rhythmic jazz of Thelonious Monk. He lost himself in the lines. He wasn't designing a monument to ego. He was designing a space for people to breathe. He was designing flood barriers disguised as rolling hills, benches carved from reclaimed pierwood, playgrounds woven into the natural landscape. Hours passed. The sky outside darkened from gray to charcoal. At 4:45 p.m., the phone on his desk rang. It wasn't a client. It was the City Planning Commission. Ethan picked up. "This is Ethan Caldwell." "Mr. Caldwell," a crisp female voice said. "This is Elena Rosales, head of the Urban Design Committee. We've finished our review of the blind submissions for the Greenpoint project." Ethan's hand tightened on the phone receiver. Yes? Your submission? The living edge. It was unanimous, Mr. Caldwell. The jury was moved. You didn't just design a park. You designed a solution for the rising tides. We'd like to award the contract to your firm. The world seemed to stop spinning for a second. The hum of the refrigerator, the typing of his interns, the distant honk of taxis, it all faded. He had won. He hadn't needed a sterling connection. He hadn't needed Julian's venture capital money. He had done it with his own mind, his own hands, his own vision. "Thank you, Ms. Rosales," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't let himself feel all day. "You won't regret this. We know we won't. We'll send the paperwork over tomorrow. Congratulations." Ethan hung up. He sat there for a moment in the dim light of the office. He looked at the framed photo of Lily on his desk. She was 7 now, missing a front tooth, smiling fiercely. "Guys," Ethan said, standing up. Maya and David looked up, startled. "Pack up. We're done for the day." "But the proposal," David started. "We got it," Ethan said, a slow smile spreading across his face, a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. "We won." The small office erupted in cheers. David high-fived Maya. It wasn't a champagne toast at the plaza. There were no celebrities, but the joy was real. It was earned. Later that evening, Ethan drove his Subaru to the Upper East Side to pick up Lily for his scheduled Tuesday dinner. The doorman at Vanessa's penthouse building looked down his nose at Ethan's car, but Ethan didn't care. Lily came running out of the lobby, her backpack bouncing. She jumped into the car, smelling of expensive shampoo and loneliness. "How was the wedding?" Ethan asked gently as he merged into traffic. Lily had been the flower girl. "It was okay," Lily shrugged, picking at a loose thread on her seatbelt. "Mommy was crying in the bathroom a lot. She said it was happy tears, but she looked mad, and Julian yelled at a waiter for spilling water." Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, but kept his voice light. "Well, weddings can be stressful." "I like your house better, Daddy," Lily said quietly, looking out the window at the city lights blurring by. "It's quiet there." "I have a surprise for you," Ethan said. "I'm going to build a new park, a huge one, right on the water, and you're going to be the first person to test the swings." Lily's eyes lit up, reflecting the street lamps. "Really? Really?" They drove across the Queensboro Bridge, leaving the glittering towers of Manhattan behind. Below them, the East River churned, dark and deep. Somewhere in the Plaza Hotel, Vanessa was dancing her first dance, surrounded by 1,000 people who loved her money, but didn't know her name. She was drinking vintage wine to drown out the silence in her heart. But here, in a beat-up car with a heater that rattled, Ethan Caldwell was the richest man in the world. He had his dignity. He had his daughter. And he had just laid the first stone of an empire built not on inheritance, but on merit. The concrete jungle was no longer a prison. It was his canvas, and he was just getting started. Spring 2025. 5 years had passed since the wedding at the plaza, and the city of New York felt different. The post-pandemic economic boom had cooled into a jittery, unpredictable recession. Interest rates were high, patience was low, and the old guard of the city was quietly panicking behind their limestone walls. In the headquarters of Sterling Media, on the 40th floor of a midtown skyscraper, the air conditioning was set to a bone-chilling 65 degrees, but Vanessa Sterling was sweating. She sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, the grain of the wood polished to a mirror finish. The room was empty save for her and the company's chief financial officer, Marcus Lynn. Marcus, a man who usually spoke in soothing, confident baritones, looked as if he hadn't slept in a week. "Say that again," Vanessa said, her voice tight. She pressed her fingers against her eyelids, trying to stop the throbbing headache that had become her constant companion. "Liquidity issues, Vanessa," Marcus repeated, sliding a thick binder across the table. "The revenue from the legacy print division is down 40%, which we expected. But the digital expansion, the venture capital injection that Julian arranged, it's not performing. In fact, the funds are inaccessible." "Inaccessible?" Vanessa snapped, opening her eyes. "What does that mean?" "It's our money. It's the family trust." "It's complicated," Marcus said, loosening his tie. The capital was leveraged into high-risk derivatives in the Asian markets. Julian assured the board it was a sure thing for quick growth, but the markets turned. "The margin calls are coming in, and we don't have the cash on hand to cover them without selling off assets." Vanessa stared at the skyline outside the window. It looked gray and indifferent. "Where is Julian?" she asked. "He's in the Hamptons," Marcus said, looking down at his hands. "He said he needed to clear his head. He's not answering his phone." Vanessa felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. It wasn't just the money, it was the pattern. Over the last 2 years, Julian Thorne, the golden boy, the savior, the man she had destroyed her first marriage for, had changed. The charm was still there, polished and bright for the cameras, but at home, it had curdled into a manic, defensive arrogance. He was always closing a deal, always fixing a problem, yet the problems only multiplied. She dismissed Marcus and walked to the window. Her reflection in the glass looked tired. At 43, she was still beautiful, but it was a brittle kind of beauty, held together by expensive creams and sheer force of will. On the coffee table in the corner of her office lay a copy of Architectural Digest. The cover feature was titled, "Healing the City: How Ethan Caldwell is Reimagining New York's Waterfront." She hadn't bought it. Her assistant had left it there, perhaps innocently, perhaps not. Vanessa picked it up. On the cover, Ethan stood on a boardwalk of weathered wood, looking out at the river. He looked older, his hair peppered with gray at the temples, but he looked solid. He wore a simple canvas jacket, his hands in his pockets. He didn't look like he was trying to sell anything. He looked like a man who knew exactly who he was. A pang of something sharp and hot pierced Vanessa's chest. It wasn't love. She told herself she had never truly loved the boring, quiet gardener, but it was envy. Pure, unadulterated envy. He was rising while she was sinking. Her phone buzzed. A text from Julian. "Don't worry about the numbers. Marcus is an alarmist. I'm handling it. Dinner tonight? I'll fly back." He was handling it, just like he handled the refinancing of the beach house that she found out about 3 months late. Just like he handled the rumors of his gambling debts in Macau. Vanessa threw the magazine into the trash bin. That evening, the penthouse on Park Avenue felt more like a museum than a home. The silence was heavy, broken only by the clinking of silverware. Julian had returned, tanned and smelling of sea salt and scotch. He was eating his steak with gusto, seemingly oblivious to the tension radiating from his wife. "So," Julian said, pouring himself another glass of red wine. "I heard you grilled poor Marcus today. You really shouldn't stress yourself with the minutiae, Nessie. That's what you have me for." Minutiae. Vanessa put her fork down. The sound rang against the china. "We are leveraging the building, Julian. My father's building, to pay off interest on loans I never authorized. You call that minutiae?" Julian sighed, a dramatic, long-suffering exhale. He wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. "You have no head for finance, Vanessa. You're a creative. Let me worry about the money. You just keep the Sterling name shiny." "The Sterling name is drowning," she hissed, "and you're the one holding the anchor." Julian's eyes flashed. For a second, the mask slipped. The charming smile vanished, replaced by a sneer that looked frighteningly familiar. It was the look of a trapped animal. "Careful, Vanessa," he said, his voice low. "Don't forget who doubled the stock price in 22. Don't forget who made you relevant again after you spent a decade playing house with that loser Caldwell." "Don't bring him into this," she said, surprising herself. "Why? Do you miss him?" Julian laughed, a cruel, jagged sound. "Do you miss the silence? Because I can stop talking if you want. I can leave, and you can explain to the board why their star investor walked out." He knew he had her. He knew she was terrified of a second public failure. A second divorce would confirm what the whispers said, that Vanessa Sterling had terrible judgment. "Just fix it, Julian," she whispered, looking away. "Just fix the money." "I always do," he said, his smile returning as if by a switch. He reached across the table and patted her hand. His skin felt cold. Later that night, Vanessa couldn't sleep. She wandered down the hall to Lily's room. Lily was 12 now. She was at a sleepover, so the room was empty. It was a chaotic teenage space. Posters of indie bands, a pile of school books, a skateboard leaning against the wall. On Lily's desk, there was a sketchbook. Vanessa knew it was a gift from Ethan. She hesitated, then opened it. The pages were filled with drawings, not of clothes or celebrities, but of trees, bridges, birds. Sketches of the city seen from weird, beautiful angles. On the last page, there was a drawing of a man and a girl sitting on a bench, watching a sunset. The caption, in Lily's loopy handwriting, read, "Dad's quiet place. No phones allowed." Vanessa traced the lines with her finger. The drawing radiated a sense of peace that was completely absent from her own life. She looked around the penthouse. The imported marble, the velvet sofas, the art that Julian had bought as investments. It all felt fake. It felt like a stage set for a play that was receiving terrible reviews. She realized then, standing in the dark, that she was lonely. She was married to the life of the party, the man everyone wanted to know, and she had never been more alone. She thought of Ethan. She thought of how he used to listen to her, really listen, without checking his watch or scanning the room for someone more important. She had mistaken his quietness for emptiness. She saw now that it was capacity. He had space for her. Julian was so full of himself, there was no room for anyone else. From the master bedroom down the hall, she heard Julian's voice. He was on the phone, shouting in a hushed, aggressive whisper. "I don't care what the SEC is asking. Stall them. If they audit the offshore accounts, we are dead. Do you hear me? Dead." Vanessa froze. The blood drained from her face. SEC, audit, dead. She backed out of Lily's room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wasn't just in a bad marriage. She was in a burning building, and the architect of this disaster was sleeping in her bed. Somewhere across the river, under the lights of Brooklyn, Ethan Caldwell was sleeping soundly, his conscience clear, his foundations deep. Vanessa closed her eyes and wished, for the first time in 5 years, that she was the one planting petunias in the dirt, safe from the height of the fall that was coming. The gala for the opening of the Greenpoint Horizon was the kind of event that New York City excelled at. a seamless blend of high altruism and aggressive social climbing. The venue was the park itself, Ethan's masterpiece. What was once a rotting industrial pier had been transformed into a floating topography of reclaimed timber, native salt-tolerant grasses, and terraced concrete that seemed to breathe with the tides of the East River. It was a warm evening in late May. The sun was setting, casting a liquid copper glow over the Manhattan skyline across the water. Waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, navigating around sculptural benches that looked like driftwood washed ashore by a benevolent storm. Ethan stood near the edge of the pier, accepting a handshake from the mayor. "It's remarkable, Caldwell," the mayor said, gesturing to the integrated flood barriers that doubled as amphitheater seating. "You didn't just build a park. You built a shield. The city owes you." "Thank you, Mr. Mayor," Ethan replied, his voice level. He wore a tuxedo that fit him perfectly, not because it was flashy, but because he carried himself differently now. His posture was relaxed, his hands steady. He was no longer the man hiding in the shadows of the drapes. He was the architect of the stage. He wasn't drinking. He held a glass of sparkling water, his eyes scanning the crowd. He saw critics who had once ignored him, now clamoring for a quote. He saw developers who had called his designs too sentimental, now taking notes. And then he saw them. A hush seemed to ripple through the entrance of the VIP tent as the Sterling family arrived. They moved as a phalanx, a defensive formation of wealth. Robert Sterling led the way, looking frail and irritated. Beside him was Vanessa, and trailing slightly behind was Julian. Vanessa looked stunning in a gown of silver sequins that mimicked the shimmering river, but up close the illusion fractured. Her eyes were darting, anxious. Her smile was too tight. She clutched her clutch bag as if it contained a grenade. Julian, by contrast, was manic. He was laughing too loudly at a joke no one had told, slapping backs, shaking hands with people who looked at him with polite confusion. Rumors of the SEC investigation hadn't hit the papers yet, but in New York, money talks, and the lack of it whispers. The whispers about Julian Thorne had been circulating for weeks. Ethan felt a strange calmness settle over him. Years ago, the sight of them would have sent his heart racing with pain and humiliation. Now, he felt the detachment of a scientist observing a specimen under glass. "They're here," Maya whispered, appearing at Ethan's elbow. She looked protective, ready to intercept. "It's fine, Maya," Ethan said. "Let them come." As if drawn by a magnetic field, the Sterlings made their way through the crowd toward the host. The guests parted, sensing the history, sensing the drama. This was the ex-husband, the gardener, standing on his own ground. "Ethan!" Julian's voice boomed, cutting through the ambient jazz. He extended a hand, his grin wide and predatory. "Look at this. You finally made something of yourself, old sport. I must say, it's a lot of concrete. Very rustic." Ethan took Julian's hand. Julian squeezed hard, a dominance play from a bygone era. Ethan didn't squeeze back. He simply held his hand firm, like a stone, until Julian was forced to let go. "It's resilient, Julian," Ethan said calmly. "Concrete survives the storms, unlike some other materials." The double meaning hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Ethan," Vanessa said. Her voice was breathy, barely audible. Ethan turned his gaze to her. For the first time in 5 years, they were face to face. He took in the lines of tension around her mouth, the shadow of fear in her eyes. He remembered the woman he had loved, but she felt like a stranger, a character from a book he had finished reading long ago. "Hello, Vanessa," he said. "No, how are you? No, it's been a while." Just an acknowledgement of her existence. "The park is beautiful," she stammered, clearly thrown by his coldness. She had expected anger, or perhaps the old puppy dog adoration. She wasn't prepared for indifference. "Lily talks about it all the time. She's so proud of you." "I know," Ethan said, his face softening slightly at the mention of his daughter. "She helped me choose the trees for the North Quadrant. She has a good eye." "She gets it from you," Vanessa said quickly, a desperate attempt to build a bridge. "She gets it from being listened to," Ethan corrected gently. The words landed like a physical blow. Vanessa flinched. Beside her, Robert Sterling cleared his throat, looking impatient. "Yes, well, good show, Ethan. We're here to support the Arts Council, of course. Sterling Media has always been a patron." "Actually," Ethan said, checking his watch, "I believe Sterling Media's donation is pending this year. But we're happy to have you as guests regardless. The open bar is to your left." It was a polite dismissal, delivered with the grace of a guillotine blade. Robert turned purple. Julian stepped forward, his face flushing. "Now listen here, Caldwell, Mr. Thorne," a deep voice interrupted. It was the police commissioner, who had walked up to shake Ethan's hand. "Good to see you, Ethan, and Julian. I didn't expect to see you here. I thought you'd be busy with your legal team." The color drained from Julian's face so fast he looked like a corpse. The commissioner didn't smile. He just stared at Julian with the heavy, knowing look of the law. Julian mumbled something incoherently, grabbed Vanessa's elbow, and practically dragged her toward the bar. Ethan watched them go. He saw the way Julian's fingers dug into Vanessa's arm. He saw the way Vanessa stumbled in her heels, her head bowed. They looked small. Against the backdrop of the massive, enduring structures Ethan had built, against the vastness of the river and the sky, the Sterling Empire looked incredibly small. "You okay?" Maya asked, returning to his side. Ethan took a sip of his water. The water was cool and clean. "I'm fine," he said, and he meant it. "I'm better than fine. I'm free." Across the deck, Vanessa pulled her arm away from Julian. She looked back at Ethan. He was surrounded by admirers, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. He wasn't looking at her. He was pointing at the horizon, explaining the future to someone who mattered. In that moment, Vanessa realized the true cost of that New Year's Eve toast. She hadn't just humiliated a husband. She had discarded a king to play house with a jester. And now, the jester was dragging her down into the dark, while the king rose with the tide. The music swelled. The city lights flickered on. The architecture of silence was complete, and it was deafening. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the Greenpoint Horizon Park was now illuminated by soft, recessed lighting that made the concrete walkways glow like bioluminescence. The jazz band had picked up the tempo, but in the VIP section, the atmosphere was thickening with a different kind of tension. Ethan was standing in a circle of heavy hitters. To his right was Arthur Vance, the CEO of the city's largest sovereign wealth fund. To his left was the Commissioner of Parks. They were listening intently as Ethan explained the sustainability metrics of the project. "It's not just about aesthetics," Ethan was saying, his voice low and compelling. "It's about resilience. We used a permeable pavement system that absorbs 90% of storm runoff. If you build on a foundation that can't handle the pressure, the cracks don't show up immediately. They show up when the storm hits, and by then, it's too late. Precisely, Vance nodded, sipping his scotch. Risk management is everything. Speaking of risk, a voice interrupted, loud and slightly slurred. Julian Thorne pushed his way into the circle. He had loosened his bow tie, and there was a sheen of perspiration on his forehead that the cool river breeze couldn't dry. He held a drink that looked like it was mostly amber liquid and no ice. "Arthur, I didn't know you were here," Julian said, clapping Vance on the shoulder with a familiarity that made the older man stiffen. "And Ethan, the man of the hour." Ethan looked at Julian. He saw the desperation vibrating off him like heat waves. "Hello again, Julian." "I was just telling Vanessa," Julian continued, ignoring the coolness in the air, "that this project is a perfect metaphor for what Sterling Media is doing next. Green tech, sustainable futures. In fact, Arthur, I've been meaning to pitch you on the new Sterling Ventures Fund. We're looking for a lead investor. High yield, low exposure." Vance looked at Julian with the weary patience of a man who had seen 1,000 hustlers. "I wasn't aware Sterling had a tech division, Julian." "We're building it." Julian grinned, gesturing grandly with his glass. "And with Ethan here, well, we're family, right? I was thinking, Ethan, we could announce a partnership tonight. Caldwell and Sterling. Your designs, our capital. We could revitalize the entire coastline. What do you say? For the sake of the city?" It was a trap. A desperate, clumsy trap. Julian was trying to use Ethan's pristine reputation to wash the stain off the Sterling name, to secure funding that would fill the black hole of his debts. The circle went quiet. Everyone looked at Ethan. Vanessa, standing a few feet away, held her breath. She knew Julian was drowning. She saw the plea in his eyes, not for forgiveness, but for a lifeline. "Save me and I'll let you be associated with us again." Ethan swirled the water in his glass. He looked at Julian, then at Vance. "That's an interesting proposition, Julian," Ethan said slowly. "But in architecture, before we commit to a partnership, we have to survey the land. We have to check the soil stability." "The soil is fine," Julian laughed nervously. "It's Sterling soil, solid as a rock." "Is it?" Ethan asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the party. "Because I read the Q1 financial disclosures for Sterling Media this morning. They're public record, of course." Julian's smile froze. "Ethan, this isn't the place. You're leveraging the Greenwich estate and the Midtown headquarters against a margin loan from a shell company in the Cayman Islands," Ethan said, reciting the facts as calmly as if he were reading a grocery list. "And the Sterling Ventures Fund you mentioned? It's heavily exposed to unrated derivatives that have lost 40% of their value in the last 6 months." A gasp rippled through the small group. Arthur Vance's eyes narrowed. "Ethan, you don't know what you're talking about," Julian snapped, his voice rising, cracking. "Stick to your plants." "I do know what I'm talking about," Ethan replied, stepping forward. He didn't loom. He simply occupied the space with absolute certainty. "I know that a structure built on debt is just a sinkhole waiting to open. And I don't build on sinkholes, Julian. I fix them." He turned to Arthur Vance. "If I were you, Arthur, I'd ask to see the audit reports before I signed anything. The structural integrity of the Sterling capital seems compromised." Arthur Vance looked at Julian. The look was one of absolute professional disgust. He set his glass down on a passing waiter's tray. "I think I've heard enough," Vance said coldly. "Julian, don't call my office." Vance walked away. The other investors followed him, like a school of fish turning away from a predator that was bleeding in the water. Julian stood alone in the center of the circle, stripped naked in front of the people he needed to impress. His face was a mask of shock and rage. "You," Julian hissed, stepping toward Ethan, his hand balling into a fist. "You ungrateful little—" "Don't," Ethan said. He didn't flinch. He looked Julian dead in the eye. "Don't make a scene, Julian. Not here, not on my ground." Julian stopped. He looked around. He saw the security guards watching him. He saw the guests whispering behind their hands. He saw the ruin of his reputation happening in real time. He turned and stormed off toward the exit, nearly knocking over a waiter. Ethan didn't watch him go. He turned his gaze to Vanessa. She was standing frozen near a pillar. She had heard everything. She looked at Ethan with wide, terrified eyes. She wasn't terrified of him. She was terrified of the truth he had just spoken. Ethan walked over to her. He stopped a polite distance away. "You didn't know," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I knew it was bad," Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling. "But I didn't know it was that." "He's gambling with your father's legacy, Vanessa," Ethan said. "The Greenwich House? It's collateral. If the SEC steps in, or if the market dips another 2 points, you lose it all. The house, the company, everything." Vanessa covered her mouth with her hand. Tears welled up in her eyes, real tears this time. "Why are you telling me this, after what I did to you?" "Because," Ethan said, looking past her at the city skyline, "I built this park for Lily, and I don't want her inheritance to be nothing but debt and scandal. You need to get out, Vanessa, before the roof collapses." He looked at her one last time. There was no hate in his eyes, only a profound, exhausting pity. "Fix your house," Ethan said. Then he turned and walked back into the light of the party, leaving Vanessa standing in the shadows of the empire she was about to lose. The gala was winding down. The jazz band had packed up their brass instruments, and the last of the limousines were idling on the cobblestones, red taillights blurring in the damp river mist. Ethan stood in the private observation lounge at the far end of the pier. It was a glass cube suspended over the water, designed to offer a panoramic view of the bridges. He was gathering his things, a leather folio and his phone, when the door slid open with a heavy, aggressive whoosh. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The scent of cigar smoke and expensive, nervous sweat filled the small room. "You think you're clever, don't you?" It was Robert Sterling. The patriarch looked older than he had an hour ago. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of mottled purple, his bow tie undone. Behind him stood Vanessa, looking like a ghost in her shimmering dress. She wasn't looking at Ethan. She was staring at the floor, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were freezing. "Hello, Robert," Ethan said, turning slowly. "I assumed you'd left with Julian." "Julian is handling a crisis that you manufactured," Robert barked, stepping into the room. He pointed a trembling finger at Ethan. "I saw what you did out there, poisoning Arthur Vance against us, spreading lies about our liquidity. You vindictive little—" "They weren't lies," Ethan interrupted, his voice calm but hard as the glass walls around them. "And Vance didn't walk away because of me. He walked away because he smelled the rot. I just opened the window." "How dare you!" Robert slammed his hand on a high-top table. "After everything we did for you? We took you in. We gave you a life. And this is how you repay us? By trying to sink the family that fed you?" Ethan let out a short, dry laugh. It was a sound devoid of humor. Fed me? Robert, I paid for my own groceries. I paid for my own car. I paid for my own student loans. We gave you status, Robert roared. We let you marry a Sterling. And look where that got me, Ethan said, his eyes shifting to Vanessa. She flinched, shrinking further into the corner. This is jealousy, Robert spat, pacing the small room. Pure and simple. You couldn't handle Vanessa's success. You couldn't handle Julian's brilliance. So you waited 5 years to throw a tantrum. You're a small man, Ethan. A gardener playing at being an architect. Ethan stared at his former father-in-law. For years he had swallowed these insults. He had let them lodge in his throat like shards of glass to keep the peace, to keep Lily safe. But Lily was safe now. He was safe now. I need to show you something, Ethan said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, unlocking a folder that had been encrypted for 5 years. He walked over to the large monitor on the wall, used for presentations, and cast his screen to the display. What is this? Robert demanded, squinting. New Year's Eve, 2018, Ethan said. The image appeared on the 60-inch screen. It was grainy, taken in low light, but the subjects were unmistakable. Vanessa pressed against the glass of the winter garden. Julian, his hands tangled in her hair, his face buried in her neck. The intimacy was raw, illicit, and undeniable. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the lapping of the water against the pier pilings below. Robert Sterling stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. He looked from the photo to his daughter. Vanessa didn't deny it. She closed her eyes, tears leaking out, sliding silently down her pale cheeks. You knew, Robert whispered, his voice losing its boom. You knew. Back then? I was standing 5 feet away, Ethan said. I heard them laughing at me. I heard them call me boring. I heard them planning to use your money to fund Julian's investments. Ethan swiped the screen. A new image appeared. This one was a bank transfer document dated February 2017, a year before the divorce. Do you recognize this, Vanessa? Ethan asked softly. Vanessa looked up, her eyes widening in shock. It was a transfer of $185,000. That was my grandmother's inheritance, Ethan said, addressing Robert. The only real money I ever had. Vanessa had run up a debt with a consultant to cover up a failed marketing launch that would have tanked the company's stock price if it went public. She was terrified you would find out, Robert. She was terrified you would cut her off. Robert turned to Vanessa, his face gray. You told me the insurance covered that loss. I paid it, Ethan said. I emptied my savings account to save your reputation, Robert, to save Vanessa's career. And on New Year's Eve, while I was standing there drinking water, you all raised a glass to mock me for being poor, for being a gold digger. Ethan turned off the screen. The room felt smaller now, suffocating with the weight of the truth. I didn't leave because I was weak, Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly with the release of 5 years of suppressed rage. I didn't leave because I was jealous. I left because I refused to let my daughter grow up in a house where loyalty is a punchline and love is a transaction. He looked at Vanessa. She was sobbing now, silent, shaking sobs that racked her entire body. I gave you 5 years of mercy, Vanessa, Ethan said. And you used them to build a life with a con artist who is currently liquidating your assets. I'm sorry, Vanessa choked out, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan, I'm so sorry. I know, Ethan said, and the tragedy was, he believed her. But it didn't matter anymore. But apologies don't fix foundations that are already rotten. He picked up his leather folio. "The SEC is coming, Robert," Ethan said, walking toward the door. "Julian has been cooking the books since 2019. I suggest you call your lawyers instead of yelling at me. You have a very long night ahead of you." He stopped at the threshold and looked back one last time. "Happy New Year," Ethan said. He walked out into the cool night air. He walked past the empty champagne glasses, past the dismantled decorations. He walked down the long wooden pier he had built with his own hands, leaving the glass box behind. Behind him, in the illuminated lounge, Robert Sterling sank into a chair, putting his head in his hands. Vanessa stood by the window, watching Ethan's figure retreat into the dark, realizing that the man she had called nothing was the only real thing she had ever known. Ethan reached his car. He didn't look back. He started the engine, and for the first time in a decade, the silence in his head wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. It was finished. The headlines hit the newsstands 3 days after the gala, screaming in bold, unforgiving black ink. "Sterling Empire crumbles. SEC raids Midtown offices. Julian Thorne arrested at JFK with one-way ticket to Macau. The end of a dynasty." In his apartment in Long Island City, Ethan Caldwell sat at his kitchen island, drinking a cup of coffee. The morning sun was streaming through the industrial windows, casting long, warm rectangles of light across the oak floor. On the television, a muted news anchor was standing in front of the Sterling headquarters. Behind her, FBI agents were carrying out boxes of files. B-roll footage showed Julian Thorne, handcuffed, disheveled, stripped of his bespoke suit and his arrogance, being ducked into a police cruiser. Ethan watched for a moment, his face unreadable. He didn't feel the surge of triumphant joy he had once imagined he might. He didn't feel a need to pop champagne or call his friends to gloat. He just felt tired. It was the exhaustion of carrying a heavy stone for 5 years and finally setting it down. He picked up the remote and turned the TV off. The screen went black, erasing the chaos of the Sterling family from his home. "Daddy?" Ethan turned. Lily was standing in the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She was wearing her favorite dinosaur pajamas. "Hey, Ladybug," Ethan said, his voice instantly softening. "You're up early." "Is Mommy okay?" she asked. "I heard her crying on the phone last night." Ethan walked over and picked her up, hugging her tightly. "Mommy is going through a hard time right now, but she's tough. She'll be okay. And you're going to see her this weekend, just like always." He wouldn't poison Lily against her mother. That was the Sterling way. Weaponizing affection. It wasn't his way. 6 months later. November 2025. The autumn air in New York was crisp, smelling of roasted chestnuts and exhaust fumes. The Greenpoint Horizon Park was now fully open to the public, and it was teeming with life. Families walked along the boardwalks. Runners navigated the trails, and old men played chess on the stone tables Ethan had designed. Ethan sat on a bench near the water, sketching in his notebook. He was waiting. A taxi pulled up to the curb, not a limousine, just a yellow city cab. Vanessa stepped out. She looked different. The armor of high fashion was gone. She wore a simple beige trench coat and flat boots. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore very little makeup. She looked older, yes, but also more human. The divorce from Julian had been swift and brutal. The bankruptcy proceedings had taken the Greenwich estate, the penthouse, and the yacht. The Sterling name, once a golden ticket, was now a liability. Vanessa was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Upper West Side, working as a consultant for a small branding firm. She walked over to the bench. She didn't sit down. She stood a few feet away, respecting the boundary. "Hi, Ethan," she said. Her voice was quiet, lacking the sharp, imperious edge it used to carry. "Vanessa?" Ethan nodded, closing his sketchbook. "Thanks for meeting me here." "It's a beautiful park," she said, looking around. "You really did it. You fixed the edge of the city." "It needed fixing," he said simply. She shifted her weight, looking uncomfortable. She reached into her bag and pulled out a white envelope. She held it out to him. "What is this?" Ethan asked, not taking it. "It's a check," she said. It's not everything, but it's the first installment, the $185,000 you paid for my debt. I'm going to pay you back, Ethan, every cent. It might take me 10 years, but I'll do it." Ethan looked at the envelope. He looked at her hands. They were trembling slightly. He saw the shame she was carrying, heavy and suffocating. He stood up. He took the envelope from her hand. "Thank you," he said. He didn't say, "You don't have to," or "keep it." That would have been an insult to her dignity. Taking the money was an acknowledgement that she was trying to rebuild her own foundation. "I also wanted to say," Vanessa started, her eyes filling with tears. She looked out at the river, unable to meet his gaze. "I wanted to say that you were right. About everything. I was so busy looking at the packaging, I never checked what was inside. I traded a diamond for a piece of glass because the glass sparkled more." She turned to him, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I miss you, Ethan. Not the money, not the house. I miss who I was when I was with you." The wind blew off the river, scattering dry leaves across the concrete. It was the moment Ethan had fantasized about for years, her complete and total regret. But now that it was here, he realized the architecture of his heart had changed. The room where he used to keep his love for her had been renovated. It was no longer a bedroom. It was just a hallway he passed through to get to his future. "You can't go back, Vanessa," Ethan said gently. "That version of us, it doesn't exist anymore. We're Lily's parents. That's what we are. And that's a good thing to be." Vanessa looked at him, searching for a crack, a sign of the old devotion. She found only kindness, the terrible, distant kindness of a stranger. She nodded slowly, wiping her face. "Okay, I understand." "I have to go," Ethan said, checking his watch. "I promised Lily I'd take her to the botanical gardens." "Right," Vanessa said. "She loves the gardens." "Take care of yourself, Vanessa." Ethan turned and walked away. He walked with a light step, his coat flapping in the wind. Vanessa stood on the pier for a long time, watching him go. She watched him merge into the crowd, a man who had built a fortress out of silence and patience, a man who had walked through the fire of humiliation and come out made of steel. As Ethan reached the exit of the park, the sun began to break through the clouds, illuminating the skyline of the city he was helping to reshape. He didn't look back at his ex-wife. He didn't look back at the past. He took out his phone and dialed. "Hey, sweetie," he said when Lily answered. "Yeah, I'm on my way. Get your shoes on. We're going to see the blooming." Ethan Caldwell smiled. The long night of New Year's Eve was finally over. The sun was up.